And this represents a lot of challenges, but a lot of really neat opportunities as well. So with that being said, the first of the sort of 6 parts that I'm going to race through today is really all about the global challenge of feeding the future, picking up on population growth, climate change, and then this thing about equity and nutrition. So population growth, how much food we need, climate change, are we going to be able to produce enough, and equity and nutrition, is the food going to keep us healthy, and is it equitably distributed? And of course, the place to start in this conversation has to be population growth. So for the sake of me not lecturing and blowing my voice out in the next hour or so, anyone know what the world's population is today or so? Roughly, ballpark, right here. 7.5 billion. I haven't looked up the data recently, but it's in that vicinity. Any idea where the population is going to go later this century? Where are we going to peak out at? 9, 10? United Nations gives us some estimates, and they're between 9 and 11, depending on what happens in terms of growth rates and things like that. So that represents a huge challenge. Many people think that we're going to have to produce 70% more food by 2050, 70% more food by 2050, if we want to just simply stay still with global nutrition. And so the magazine The Economist did a series on this a few years ago, just a couple of years ago, and this is how they put it. In the next 40 years, humans will need to produce more food than they did in the previous 10,000 years put together. So just think about that for a second. Scale of the accomplishment, the scale of the challenge is really kind of breathtaking in my opinion. And at the same time, of course, we have to deal with climate change that'll likely make some of our most productive regions less productive, make food harder and more expensive to produce. And you know, when we think of climate change, at least I usually think of droughts, but we also have to think of melting glaciers. Why would we care from a food security perspective about melting glaciers?
They provide water for agriculture.
Provide water for agriculture. Anyone want to make a guess as to how many people depend on melting glaciers for their agriculture? Billion and a half people or so are dependent on melting glacier water for the agricultural systems. Now in the short term, what does melting glaciers do, or faster melting glaciers do? What's the problem in the short term? Flooding, absolutely. Landslides over there, completely agreement. And then in the long term, of course, the problem is once the melting glaciers have melted, drought, exactly. So big problems there. Closer to home, does anyone here remember the summer, or the spring rather, of 2012? I know that's a while ago, 6 years ago. Sorry, well, go with you first. Sorry, we'll come back to you in a sec. Bingo. We were up in the low 20s in March. I remember March break of 2012. I was out gardening, which is kind of weird. The apple trees, pictured here, all blossomed. Then April got a frost, which is normal for April, and 90% of Ontario's apple harvest was destroyed that year. And I knew orchardists that actually went to the insane lengths of flying helicopters over their orchards to keep the air moving so the blossoms wouldn't freeze. And so actually the predictions are that we're going to experience probably more stuff like 2012 in the future thanks to climate change. So that represents, you know, a significant challenge in terms of food security. And a lot of people actually think that we're actually beginning to experience the problem right now. That this isn't a problem for tomorrow or the next generation. This is a problem of the right now. And here's some data. And what I'm about to show is the United Nations Food Price Index. It's data that gives us essentially a snapshot in time of how much food costs. It's a weighted average representing sort of a basket of goods collected from markets around the world. And 100 is the long-term average. And this is what we see since between 1990 and 2017 in terms of the United Nations Food Price Index. So somebody shout out the first thing that you notice on this, this data set. What's happened to food prices over the last 20 years or so? They're high, absolutely. We are totally high. That's the first point to mention. Another point to mention. What's that? They dropped, absolutely. And if you've got high and dropping together in a data series, you might call that what from maybe a statistical perspective? I know, stats. Damn, stats. Highly variable or volatile, or it's a bit of a roller coaster. So it's pretty amazing, actually. You know, food prices just shot up in 2007, 2008. Just skyrocketed, right? And then they crashed with the financial crisis. And then they shot up again on the backs of a few droughts in China and Russia in 2011. And then they have sort of come down for a ways. Now they feel like they're shooting up again. So a lot of people say that actually this is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this is the global food crisis happening in real time. It's been happening for 11 years now, since 2008. And that unless we produce all this more food to deal with climate change, to address the global population growth, unless we do this, this is the tip of the iceberg. We're going to have high volatile prices from now on. Now, I'm going to actually demolish that argument I just made in a second. I'm going to come back and I'm going to present data that actually takes us in a very different direction. But before I do that, let me make a really clear point. These high volatile prices represent a major food security challenge for people around the world. Probably 100 million people deeper in poverty as a result of these high prices. Something like that. It's hard to actually get a good count, but we do get a sense of the food security implications of this high volatile prices in looking at these two photographs. So I'll show you two photographs, and I'm going to ask you what the differences are in a second. The first photograph will show you how much food you could buy for $1 on a market in the African nation of Zambia in 2007, before that first price spike. The second photograph will show you how much food you could buy on the same market for the same amount of money 12 months later when food prices were high. So here's the 2007 shot, and here's the 2008 shot. And you know, just shout out, you know, play that game, you know, memory game. What's different about these two photographs? And you can start with the blindingly obvious. No one will criticize you for stating the blindingly obvious. What's different about these two photographs?
One less tomato.
One less tomato. Exactly. Anything else? What was that? One less bushel of greens, yeah. What's worse on the right? Beg pardon?
The lighting's worse on the right.
The lighting is definitely worse on the right, yeah. They did not have as good a day for that photograph. What do you think this little bag of stuff is in the center of the photo on the left? Yeah. It's actually fish, but not a perfectly appropriate answer. And from a food science or health nutrition perspective, what does nuts or fish provide in a diet? Protein. And is it on the photograph on the right? No. So not only is there a lot less food, we've also lost some critical food ingredients, right? Protein typically is an expensive part of the diet, doesn't fill you up necessarily in terms of satiating hunger. You're better just to eat the cassavas or the whatevers. So there's major food security implications. Here we have this a snapshot of some of the political implications of this crisis. And the map here shows countries that between 2008 and 2011 experienced what they call food riots. This is people taking violently to the street, outraged over the price of their daily bread. And the first thing I'll have you note is there was a lot of countries, and they basically were on all continents. Like this was a global phenomenon in these years with these high price spikes. And when you zoom down into the streets, you get images like this one, which was taken, I believe, in Egypt immediately before the Arab Spring in 2011. And if you look closely in the guy in the front, he's got a French baguette, which he's using. If you look closely, there's actually, I think, 5 French baguettes in this photograph. And somehow the French baguette, raised into the air, becomes some sort of weird symbol of international protest over the food system. Here's a fun photograph. I believe this shot was taken from Haiti in 2008 during their food riots. And just look at the guy in the front. Look what he's holding. And what's coming down the line at him? What's coming at him? Riot cops. So somehow the French baguette's now a machine gun leveled against this line of riot police At any rate, so we see some major political ramifications, right? Massive political ramifications. Haiti's government fell after the food riots in 2008. Egypt's government fell after the food riots of 2011. And I'm not saying that high prices caused the problem, but they were a trigger. These high food prices were the last straw on the camel's back that broke people and brought them out into the street saying, I'm upset about political corruption, I'm upset about police brutality, I'm upset about unfair trading agreements, and now I got to pay more for my veggies, I'm out. But let's pause for a second. And this is where I'm going to start making a counter-narrative that bridges into the rest of the session. Let's instead of saying, okay, we've got these high volatile prices, therefore we must produce more food. Let's instead of concluding from the data that we need to produce more food, let's ask it as a question. If we produce more food, will that have a measurable effect on things we care about? In other words, if we produce more food, will food prices be cheaper? Will people go to bed better fed? Will there be better nutrition? Will there be better equity? And just reflect on that question for a second, and maybe a few of you want to shout out answers. If we produce more food, will the world be a better place, now or into the future? What do you think? Depends on the quality. Thank you for that. It depends on the quality of the food that's being produced. Absolutely important nature. Because food's not a thing. It's a whole lot of things that our bodies metabolize to make us healthy. Good point. Anything else? Yeah?
It depends on how you use the food rather than how much you grow.
A large amount of it depends on what we do in the kitchen, in the food processing plants. The whole food science department. Yes, 100%. Any other answers to this question? Yeah, sorry. Didn't see your hand up. Depends on how it's distributed. Absolutely correct. And what about economic? Oh, yeah, sorry.
Like affordability, like you can still have a lot of food, but if no one can afford it, it's not really helping anyone.
Affordability is a vital issue. 100% agree there. And I'll go one last comment.
I was going to say also how we deal with the waste of the food that we produce.
And food waste. We have to think about food waste. So I've got slides on almost all of these topics that you've just brainstormed with me. But first of all, let me show you some data, which I think exposes a lot. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go back to the United Nations data, and on the y-axis I'm going to put food supply, which is a globally collected data set. It's in dietary calories per person on the planet per day. So it's standardized for population growth, so it's per person per day, how much food are we producing. And in 1990, and then I'm just going to leave the price data in blue in the background so you can see the two overlap. Does anybody want to make a guess as to how much food was available per person per day in 1990? Or how much there is today? Play the guessing game with me. Beg your pardon?
A lot more now.
Absolutely correct. A lot more now. In 1990, there was 2,600 calories for every woman, man, and child on the planet. As you just pointed out, this has trended steadily upwards. The last year that the UN collects this data for was up to 2013, so I haven't got the full data set, unfortunately, but up to 2013, we can say that there was more food on the planet per person than at any point in human history, and there were more people on the planet in 2013 than any previous point in human history. So we've got a lot more food. There's actually, according to the United Nations data, 2,850 calories per person on the planet. So 2,800 calories for everybody on the planet, and this has gone up. What do you conclude from that? What does that tell you about the world's food system? It's more efficient. We could argue about whether it's more efficient. There's big environmental costs associated with producing all this food. Certainly productive. I'm not sure I'm going to go with you on efficient, but we can debate that. That's a really good question. You, please.
Quantity isn't the problem.
Quantity is not the problem. Yep. Anything else?
Some people have more concentrated in some areas of the world than others.
Absolutely. Equity and distribution are big issues. 100% agreement. The other thing that I think is worth looking at is, I got a grimace a few minutes ago when I mentioned stats. Put your stats hats on, if you've got any, And tell me, is there a correlation between the orange line, which is supply, and the blue line, which is price? Correlation meaning one might link to the other. What do you think? So I've got, did I hear a yes in the back? I've got one person saying yes. Does anybody want to counter that one or say something different?
No.
You said no. So why have you said yes and you said no? And maybe you're saying no just to be contrary.
Partially that, and a little bit because when it dips, there's not a major dip.
Yeah. And why did you say yes?
Just overall trend lines are both going up.
Yeah, so it is yes in that at the end of this data series, both points are higher than the beginning of the data series. So you're correct in that assessment, but I actually think you're probably more correct in that, you know, food prices go up and then they come down. Food prices then go way up and then they come way down. Food prices go way, way, way up, and all the while food supply advances in a fairly steady way. Every year is bigger than the next. So if you actually ran a regression analysis or a correlation analysis through this, you have what's called a very low R squared, where the two data lines, except for the beginning and the end of the series, actually are not in touch with each other at all. So I would say from this data, there's actually no evidence that if we simply increase production, we'll decrease price or will make the world a better place in any way, shape, or form. And that's because of a whole bunch of things. The food we've got isn't very well distributed. There are approximately 2 billion people on the planet who struggle with issues of chronic disease related to having too many calories, and approximately 800 million that struggle from not having enough calories. And the world is a deeply inequitable place. So to make this a bit more visual, here's two photographs from a really great photo essay that came out about 10 years ago. And the two journalists, Peter Menzel and Faith DeLucio, traveled around the world, and they took families, and they took formal family portraits, you know, the mom, the dad, the kids. But with each family around the world, they took 1 week's worth of groceries, and they arrayed 1 week's worth of groceries around the family. And in this way, they introduced us to the Revis family from North Carolina. And they spend $86 or so, if my memory is right, per person per week on food. And again, what do you notice about the Revis family's grocery list?
There's no lack.
Mostly refined. Well, I heard something back here. There's no
Lack.
huge quantities, heavily refined.
It's really like those dense foods, like foods that are really high in fats and really little like vegetative matter.
Yep, so almost no fruit and veg. There's a little bit of grapes and some tomatoes right in the center, but you got to look carefully for it. Super calorie dense, super fat dense. Sodium probably really, really high. Looking at all the pizza and processed meats and stuff, you're going to have super high sodium on this diet. Anything else? Yeah.
I also see like some stuff from like fast food chains like pizza and like McDonald's.
Yeah, tons. You know, Burger King, KFC, McDonald's, all on the right. These pizzas on the left. 100%. Lots of eating out, obviously, or lots of fast food. Very good point. Very astute point. A lot of food, but not necessarily filling. Yeah.
A lot of like sugary drinks and stuff in the back.
Huge amount. Look at the cases of pop and beer at the back. And all the, I don't know if it's Gatorade or something like that. And lot of pop. Like a lot of, I bet there's thousands of calories just in sugared beverages on that counter.
Many of the foods have a long shelf life.
Hey, that's a neat one. I've never thought of that one. These will be very, very long shelf life foods. That's a good point. Here is the opposite side of the equation, of course. This is the Notomos family. They're from Mali. $1.75 per person per week, I think, was their budget. And let's have a similar conversation. What are you seeing here? Ton of fiber, yeah. Lots of fiber, yeah.
A ton of family members.
Good point. Lots and lots of kids, aunties, grandparents. I don't know who they all are, but big extended family, yep. Yep, and then you? So start with you.
Kind of just bring up the presets with multiple generations in the same area, not less food than previous generations.
Absolutely. So higher number of people, lower amount of food. Yeah, over the corner.
Like raw, unprocessed food.
Super unprocessed, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Not a lot of protein, unless some of those are nuts.
So I'm going to guess most of that's lentils in those bowls. So there may be a fair bit, but it might not have your full amino acid composition because I think it's a lentil-based diet. So was it, yeah, right here.
Not a lot of fat.
And very little fat. And almost no red food coloring. Look at the look at the American diet from just a color palette perspective. So I think we have to conclude, of course, that the issue is way more complicated than producing more food. It has to do with how we distribute food. Somebody over here, I think, said something about food waste. Does anyone want to make a guess at how much food in the world is wasted? Does anybody know that statistic offhand? Sorry? 30. Yeah, about 30% of the world's food is wasted. It's interesting. In the developing world, the global south, the poor parts of the world, where does the food waste happen? Does anybody know? Storage. I heard two people say storage. Exactly. It's generally inefficient storage facilities. And in Canada, the US, the so-called developed world, where does it happen? Homes, mostly in our homes. So it's interesting. It's like a whack-a-mole, right? You hit the problem down on this side, and it pops up in another. Because as soon as a country gets wealthy enough to invest in decent quality grain storage, it becomes so cheap that consumers waste it. So it's a really wicked problem to solve. And I put my hand up as a perpetrator of this problem. I cleaned out the fridge. I've got young kids. I cleaned out the fridge this weekend, and it was really embarrassing how much stuff had just turned to sludge in our crisper. Vancouver and Canada has put a fair bit of effort into this, and these are some statistics drawn from their Love Food, Hate Waste campaign. So according to Metro Vancouver, they throw 80,000 potatoes away a day, 30,000 eggs, and 70,000 cups of milk. And that's just one Canadian city. So yeah, food waste is an enormous issue. So equity and distribution, waste, and then somebody, when I asked the question, if we produce more, is it going to be enough? I think it was you said, is it the right kind of food to make us healthy? Well, here's some neat statistics which I really love presenting. So a couple of years ago, I had somebody from food science, I think. She's graduated last year, so you wouldn't know her. Her name was Sam. And I said to Sam, could you go through nutritional guidelines for me, and could you go through the United Nations data for me and compare what we should be eating with what we're actually producing at a global level. So on the left-hand side of this slide is what we should be eating, and I'm using the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate Model, which is a nutritional guideline. And the right-hand side is actually what we're producing based on UN statistics. And we start with those fruits and veggies. According to Harvard nutritionists, fruit and veggies should be about 50% of our diet, or if you're looking at your plate, half of your plate should be filled with salad and slices of apples and stuff like that. Depending on age and stage and gender and stuff like that, 8 to 12 servings per person per day. Then if you add a waste term, we probably need to produce 13 or 14 servings of fruit and vegetable to make sure we've all got enough. Well, when Sam went to the data and converted all the UN data on food production into things like dietary servings, he discovered that we only produce about 3.5 servings of fruit and veg on the planet per person per day. So we're only producing like a third of what we really should be producing. By contrast, grains, that should be about a fifth of our plate or a fifth of our diet, represent about half of the global food supply. And this is grains that are available for human consumption. This is not livestock feed. That's already been taken out. This is not bioethanol crops. That's also been taken out. This is simply food planted for human consumption. The Food and Ag Organization of the United Nations is very clear. Oils and fats, we really, really overproduce. So all those acres of palm oil and canola and whatnot, we are really, really overproducing fats and oils. Now, when I display it as a pie chart, it doesn't appear this way, so I'll display this as a bar graph in a second. But when we look at proteins and dairies, we are more or less at the right levels. We're a little under on protein and a little under on dairy, a little under on protein and a little over on dairy, as opposed to what the recommendations should be. But we're pretty close. Not well distributed, but pretty close. But does anyone want to make a guess as to what the missing pie piece on the right-hand side is that the nutritionists do not recommend we eat, but that we produce a whole lot of? What was that?
Sugar.
100%. Come on, there we go. Huge proportion of the world's food supply is sugar. Largely sugar beet and sugar cane. Yeah?
Just a question about the pie chart there.
Yep.
So we see that we want to have a lot more fruits and vegetables produced.
Yep.
It's a lot harder to produce those fruits and vegetables. Like the land we can use for grain, a lot of times we wouldn't be able to use for these. So what's the solution?
So that's a really good question. It's a super, super good question. And some of the land we currently use for grains can be used for fruits and vegetables. So for instance, in Ontario, we have seen over the last 30 years, we've seen a big conversion of horticulture fields into corn and soybeans and wheat. Corn and soy mostly. So, you know, in a place like Ontario, we've lost a lot of acres of vegetables and we put on a lot of acres of commodities. And that's just reflecting market realities because prices are high for one and not high for the other. So there is some substitutability. So it's a good point, and there is some substitutability. I think that we have to seriously be investing in horticultural research, and we've put so much emphasis in research into commodities, and we've put very little research historically into horticulture, and that's got to change. And then I think things like vertical farming, indoor farming, greenhouses will bring new opportunities or new frontiers to produce those crops on. But this is a big challenge, right? And you're right, it's easy to produce potatoes and it's hard to produce peaches. So, we're facing a real challenge here. I said I'd just display it as a bar chart to make it a little bit more clear where we're over and under producing specifically. So there's the sort of data in more absolute instead of proportional terms. And you can see we're producing a little bit too much dairy. There's so much controversy over how much dairy we should eat in our diets. I say that with a lot of trepidation. Some dietary recommendations have lots of dairy, others have no dairy. So treat this with a grain of salt. It gives you sort of a rough perspective, but it's not a specific tool. But the bottom line is too much grain, too much fat, not enough fruit and veg. So I'm making the point. Feeding the future is probably more about how we produce things, in other words, sustainability. It's about what we're producing, nutrition. It's about food waste. It's about equity. It's not really so much about how much food we produce. But I want to go back one last time to this graph. And I want to, instead of saying, well, is this driven by population growth or things like that, I want to make a point here. And that if we put the price of oil in US dollars per barrel over this same period of time, we actually see what I would call a very tight correlation, an extremely tight correlation, at least since 2008. So in 1990 to 2005, food prices go up and down. Oil prices were really flat. But look what's happened since 2007 and 8. These two lines are almost in lockstep with each other. Almost in lockstep. And that's partly because farming itself has become very energy dependent. So the price of commodities is linked to the price of energy because the farmers are buying fertilizer and driving their tractors, and that makes them dependent or vulnerable to changes in energy prices. But there's a few other things that have gone on in society that have also caused energy prices and food prices to kind of lock together. So as I wrap up the first part, the key message I want to leave you with is this. We've already got enough food, but we waste it. It's not particularly healthy, and it's not particularly well distributed. So I don't think it's just a matter of producing more to make sure people are better fed. We've got to be far, far more discriminating as that. And I need to preface my comments, or as a postscript to my comments rather, say I'm not blaming farmers for this. I don't want to be interpreted in that way at all. I mean, farmers are individual agents choosing, making decisions to ensure that they've got something to sell that the market will reward them for. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's exactly how farmers should behave. The system, however, creates all these weird signals that results in these weird problems of too much corn and not enough vegetables present in the market. With all that being said, I've probably taken a somewhat down tone to this and been a little pessimistic. The story of food security told this way is kind of a depressing story, but actually I'm very optimistic about it, and in particular I'm optimistic about Canada's future, and in particular I'm optimistic about your future in this broad area. And my sense of optimism started about 3 years ago when I got approached by this guy's office. This guy's Canadian. He lives all over the world now. His name's Dominic Barton, and he's the lead guy at an organization called the McKinsey Institute, which is one of the world's largest consulting groups. Basically, blue chip companies hire them to write reports. And the Canadian government, when Trudeau's government took power, our finance minister, the Honourable Bill Morneau, reached out to Dominic Barton and said, we've just got a new mandate. We want to do stuff, make investments in Canada that will jumpstart our economy, that will grow middle class incomes and create jobs for normal Canadians. Can you, Dominic Barton, form an advisory committee on economic growth made up of some of the world's best business brains to make some recommendations? And Dominic Barton's office spent, I think it was 2 summers ago, a lot of time consulting. And they actually called us here at the University of Guelph and said, look, we've heard about this ag sec stuff and ag sector and all these cool things that are happening in agriculture and food. Can we do some brainstorming? So I convened a meeting at the boardroom at the UC when we brought these people together and we sort of said, right, there's really cool things happening in the ag food sector. And at the conclusion of the Barton report, they released this report called The Path to Prosperity, Resetting Canada's Growth Trajectory. It's a report from the Advisory Council of Economic Growth. First versions came out in October 2016, so about 2 years ago. The final version came out in the, spring 2017, so about 18 months ago it all came out. And in it they said, bet on ag and food. Ag and food can be an engine of economic growth. There's a tremendous amount of innovation happening. There's cool technologies. And Canada, because it's got a good infrastructure, it's got smart farmers, it's got an educated workforce, it's got good policy and regulatory environment, we've got CFIA, the Food Inspection Agency. We've got the ingredients to be world leaders in this. And actually, you know, I really think that that Barton and the Advisory Council is right. There's tremendous opportunities here. And I think that the opportunities fall into sort of 4 broad areas, which I'm going to run through now. And I'll give each of them a little bit of time so you get a sense both of what the opportunities are for the sector, but maybe imagine yourself in these opportunities. As well as what the University of Guelph specifically is doing. So I'm doing a bit of a cheerleading routine for the university here. And the first has to be all sorts of new crazy technologies which are changing how farms operate. And to set this part of my talk up, I'm going to just jump back, take you down a trip down memory lane. That is me sitting on my grandfather's lap. There's my brother, Nick, and my cousin Dave, my cousin Ian on the back of the tractor. I'm going to guess, based on my age, that it was, I don't know, 1978 or something like that. Star Wars had probably just come out the first time. I went to Star Wars for my 5th birthday. I look about 5, so there we go. My grandfather had probably been told by my grandmother 10 minutes earlier, Frank, for the love of God, get these kids out of the house. They're driving me crazy. And Grandpa was actually an OAC grad from the 1930s and had done horticulture. And this was the family farm in Niagara. And Grandpa threw us in the tractor and drove us around. And the reason I'm sharing this photograph isn't just to sort of indulge myself, but of course I'm doing that, or to brag about my family's fine vintage Massey Ferguson tractor, which is an excellent Canadian-made piece of technology. No, when I was a teenager, I would, and for 1st and 2nd and 3rd year university, I'd spend summers with my grandfather, and he was an old school, not very technologically sophisticated farmer, and we were producing sweet corn, strawberries, melons, those kind of crops, market crops. And Grandpa would drive slowly through these fields, and I'd stand on the back of the tractor where my cousins and my brother are, and I'd have a bag of fertilizer or bins of fertilizer on either side of me, and my job would simply be to throw handfuls of fertilizer onto the fields. And you know, any of you that have a proper farming background will laugh at that story, because I'm going to guess that at least 50% of that fertilizer was wasted, right? It didn't end up on the right place at the right time for a plant to utilize. And it either ended up in Lake Erie, where it helped contribute to the algae bloom problems, or it ended up in the atmosphere where it became a greenhouse gas, and probably is still sitting there as a greenhouse gas today. But of course, farming is different than it was even in the 1980s. And here's the new Case International Harvester. Just take a pause and look at this tractor. And for someone that doesn't have a farming background, what's missing on this tractor, or in this tractor, or in this photograph? What was that? There's no steering wheel. There's no seat. This is an auto steer vehicle, right? Like, no humans allowed, no humans needed. And it's kind of crazy, right? This is a smart tractor that knows where it is in the field and puts the right amount of fertilizer in the right place with no waste. Or at least that's where technology is taking us to. This whole area of precision agriculture, where tractors will see the field not as a field, but as a series of fine-grained management units, and we'll put the seed down that needs to go in that management unit, and then we'll put a different seed into a different management unit, or change the spacing of the seeds, or change the fertilizer technology. And you know, it's a brave new world where we're going to be able to produce more food on less land with fewer inputs. And we can also help boost productivity, or profitability rather, for farmers. So this issue of profitability is something that a few of us have been working on here at the University of Guelph. These are our colleagues, Madhura Nand. She's led this project with support from me and Clarence Swanton from Crop Ag, and Aaron Berg from Geography. And we've been working with these data that comes off these tractors, and have come up with assessments like this one. So this is a field, and it shows profitability for this field. And this was a particularly bad year for this farmer. It was a soybean crop, and the red areas are areas where the value of the harvest did not meet the value of the inputs. In other words, they spent more on inputs than they got in crops value off of that. Which is kind of neat, right? I mean, this farmer could have turned the seeder and the fertilizer off on those red areas, taken the unprofitable areas out of production, maybe let some wildflowers grow on them for pollinator habitat or something like that, and would have actually made more money, because they were losing money on every one of those red squares. So one of the things that technology is giving us the opportunity to do is be much more precise with their management. Yes?
I would disagree with that previous statement about turning your planter off, your fertilizer spreader off.
Yeah.
In fact, in some cases, that might bump it up, because, for example, it could be low fertility. If you put twice the amount of fertilizer down, it actually would grow something you productive. Or you could tile drain, and because it's just a wet supply, you need to drain it, you could grow something and actually make more money on that part of the field than you could on the parts that are green.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're going to have to sort of agree on this one. When you start using these kind of data, you can suddenly start seeing ways of making productivity, or if you decide the area is not going to be productive, you can turn it off. I mean, it means that we're not treating a field as a field anymore, and we can be way more precise. At least we're going to be there. I don't think we're there yet in terms of the technology. It sounds like you've got a background in this, so are we there yet? We're getting there. That's my sense as well. Same sort of things happening in the dairy industry in particular. Well, livestock in general, but dairy industry. So, I mean, any of you from dairy farms, dairy backgrounds? Yeah, so you'll know what this is, right? Robotic milker course. Anybody not know what this is? All right, so I'm just going to skip by it. We got robotic milkers. We got the same thing happening at the genetics level. And have any of you taken classes with this lady before? So she's pretty neat. She's in the Ontario Vet College. Her name's Bonnie Millard, and last year she won an award for innovation from the Governor General of Canada. 2 years ago, beg your pardon. And Bonnie's work has been with dairy cows and beef cows, specifically dairy, and she's identified, using genomic technology, identified cows with enhanced immune systems, and then used breeding techniques to breed the enhanced immune system into the herds, and it's called Immunity Plus is the technology she's developed. And essentially what it means is Immunity Plus cows stay healthier with fewer antibiotics. And now Bonnie's turning her attention to what she calls climate resilience. Can she identify climate resilient animals using genomic technologies and then breed climate resilience? In other words, the ability to remain productive for a dairy cow, for instance, under hot, dry conditions, and breed those in. And the sense that I'm going to give you, hopefully giving you with, is that we're creating these new technologies which are going to be extraordinary in terms of allowing us to boost production and reduce environmental impact. And this is one of the reasons why Dominic Barton in the Advisory Council on Economic Growth said to the federal government, bet on agriculture, because it's going to be an engine for innovation. I'd like to shift our conversation now to the food end of the spectrum. And I'm going to say similar things about what's happening at the food end of that farm to fork continuum. And there's big changes coming down the pipe in terms of the food we eat. And in particular, I think the protein industry, and I say this without trying to take sides on this, I'm saying this because I'm reading the tea leaves, not because I'm betting on this, but I'm going to say that the protein industry in particular is set for massive disruption over the next 20 years. And does anyone want to make a guess as to why I just said that? Why do I think the protein industry is set for disruption over the next 10 or 20 years?
Could be because of environmental factors. So perhaps like seafood where it's wild caught, populations that are slowly diminishing will obviously lead in less yield.
Yep. So big environmental impacts associated with current protein systems that we will be trying to reduce. That's definitely one reason. The back, and then I'll come over here.
There's, like, you could raise farm fish way more efficiently than you can raise beef or pork.
I agree. And why is that?
It's, well, feed is almost 1-to-1 versus cattle or pigs where it's like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, fish have a natural advantage in that they're cold-blooded, so they don't spend a lot of energy on keeping warm, keeping their body temperatures up. So of the energy they eat, they put more in, they spend less just on metabolism and more into growth. And secondly, fish, because they're in water, they don't have to put a lot of energy into bones, right? They don't have to worry, they've got buoyancy because of the water. They don't have to, their bodies don't build these really energy expensive bone systems. So for both of those reasons, fish have mammals beat in terms of what you're talking about, which is a feed to gain conversion, right? The ratio of the amount of feed that goes in versus the amount of usable fish you get out. So yes, fish have a big advantage. There was a hand over here. Yeah?
I'd say probably consumer habits.
Consumer habits, so give us a little bit on that.
People are making more informed decisions, or what they think are more informed decisions about where they're getting protein from.
Yep, people are making so informed in what regard? Are people picking up on this comment that people are more concerned about the environment, or what's going into that change of decision?
Yeah, definitely that. Maybe just like kind of what Curtis said about how many inputs you need to get the same yield of protein from it, or the environmental implications, but also just the health implications as well.
Yep.
Personal.
Yeah, there's a perception, true or not true, that eating fish is something we should be doing more of, and eating beef is something we should be doing less of for our health. I'll come back to you in a sec. I think there was a hand. Was there a hand over here? All right, another comment?
Yeah, to add on to the consumer habits, it also could be because like we're not really changing our perception of which like meats are acceptable by society, and by that I mean if you do want to maximize like protein yield, the ideal way would be to eat insects, but obviously nobody wants to do that. And we go towards things such as vegetables, which require a lot more water, a lot more resources, a lot more energy to produce compared to other sources of protein.
Yep. I'll come back to that very point in a second about edible insects. I'm going to say that the thing that we haven't heard about in this conversation yet is actually the creation of alternatives that are economically, commercially viable alternatives. And boy, industry is paying attention to these alternatives. So here's a product, and I need to preface this. I'm not a vegetarian. I love steak and ice cream. I want to keep eating steak and ice cream for the rest of my life, but I'm also aware I have to cut back. So all of this is true. Steak ice cream, that's my favorite. But here's a product. The company's called Sweet Earth. It goes by the nickname benevolent bacon. It contains absolutely no bacon. I quite like bacon. It sounds a bit weird. I've not tried this one. The reason I put it up here is food giant Nestle just bought Sweet Earth. So Nestle is investing in this. Here's a recent acquisition by Maple Leaf Foods. Light Life, meat without the middleman. It's a plant-based protein company. Yeah.
What was the bacon beta then?
I think it was a soy product.
Okay.
I haven't tasted that one, so I don't know, but pretty sure it's a soy product. There was a hand up here somewhere. Somebody else? No? Okay. Don't know if anybody's been in Zehrs in the last 6 months, but picking up on your point, I mean, we now have President's Choice cricket protein. It's for sale. It's real. Interestingly, the company that makes the cricket grillions itself was purchased by Maple Leaf Foods, Canada's largest food processor. And in the last 18 months, Maple Leaf Foods has bought 3 alternative protein companies. And I do work with Maple Leaf, and Maple Leaf CEO Michael McCain says the future is less but better quality meat, but more protein. And our company is going to make protein.
Sorry, I'd also like to drop a fun fact. So I also feel like the cricket protein thing is also towards consumer interest, because if we were to farm an insect that would be most ideal, it'd actually be cockroaches and not crickets. So certain tropical roaches, they don't die, they're not as volatile as crickets, and they do have a greater protein content. But I guess people are more likely to eat crickets than they would to consume them.
All right, well, let's have a conversation about that. How fixed are consumers against alternative proteins? Or how fixed are they to beef, pigs, chickens? I'm going to go with the 2 comments here, and then I'll come down here. So yourself, right there.
I think it's because of the most people find it harder to eat something that's crickets versus the culture where all that protein, but it's not necessarily.
So you're thinking a good education marketing campaign can shift this. All right, I mean, what do any of us know, right? We're talking about the future. That's as good an answer as I can imagine. You think you had a hand up?
I think we're pretty tough. People who've eaten meat for 1,000 years around here anyway, sure, Africa and that kind of thing would have a pretty good meat source down in the hot dog.
So we've got you saying it's all about education, and you saying we're not over my dead body, basically. I'm teasing you, but I'm with you. I'm agreeing with both of you. I don't know. Yeah?
I think the shift is actually going to be relatively easy so long as it's pitched the right way, because most people who eat meat are actually not okay with the fact that their animals are being killed or slaughtered the way they are, but because they can't see the head on the plate, they're okay with eating it. You know what I mean? So if you take something... Got some
controversy here. All right, you're throwing some sparks around. I can get that. All right, let's keep it respectful. I am agreeing with. I agree with all these points. These are the points we need to be talking about. I saw your hand up next.
It would be pretty tough. I don't think that a shift. I don't think that just education will change people's minds. For some people, eating meat is like a tradition almost, right? It's ingrained in their homes, right? It's very, very important to them.
Okay, so we've got another person on sort of the strength of the culture about meat consumption. Yeah.
I think it's possible to make a switch, but I don't think the soy bacon that you showed there is ever going to replace bacon in a lot of people's minds, because it probably is tasty, but there's no way it's ever going to be nearly as tasty as regular bacon.
I tend to agree. But I like a lot of soy products as well, or plant-based products. Anyone interested in a cheddar cheese larvette? I saw some hands over here. I've lost track of hands, so apologies. We'll go for you next.
I feel like a lot of people, maybe not crickets, but I feel like a lot of people are more open to the idea of incorporating more plant and soy-based protein instead of meat traditionally. So I think it'll probably be a mix of both. rat, like there's mayo without eggs.
Yep. Yep, and so good point. So speaking that we'll probably, it's not going to be one or the other, but there may be a mixture. I'm going to get a couple more comments and then close it down. I haven't heard from you yet today.
I was going to say that I think it depends a lot on where you're from. I feel like if you're from a small town, the farm towns are more apt to from the farms and the meat that's produced there. But like going to cities and bigger diversity that can change a lot. The cost of the beef versus the alternative you have on that for the experience. I think there's a big cost difference there.
Yeah.
What kind of family or ethnicity you're from, like where you are financially, is determined.
So lots of things that confound this. Dietary choices, culture, economics. Yeah, up here in the back, and then we'll just work our way across. So let's go to the corner, and then we'll come to you.
Is it compared to like GMOs or like hormones and things like that? Like, are they lab grown or like GMO soy products rather than the natural products?
So I'm not going to, that's a great question. It's not one I don't think any of us have an answer for. You're pointing out what you're perceiving of as an irrationality amongst the consumer, but the consumer isn't a person. The consumer's all sorts of people. There's 7 billion consumers. So you're right. I mean, some people may make what you would perceive as irrational choices because they feel yucky about GM this, but okay about GM that. I mean, there's lots of contradictions, and I'm not dismissing your point. I'm just saying we just have to sort of say, yep, that's the world. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, that's all it's coming back to is now that, especially in the United States, you have to label anything that is a GMO product. It's hard to like a plant-based product like protein because all soybeans pretty much are GMO.
Yep.
And there's actually lots of marketing like trends and facts that say that consumers do notice that and will not buy anything that says GMO.
Yep. So lots of issues about consumer taste, which are really hard to unpack. Anybody got something burning to say on this one before I move on? Yeah, one last comment.
I also think it depends on age, because like say like you can't teach a bulldog new tricks. A lot of people as they get older, they get more dead set in their ways, so they're not going to be open to trying new things like cricket pattern. But younger people might think, oh yeah, I might as well try it.
Yep, I agree. So there's cultural issues that you talked about, economic issues that may affect this, and of course, you're right. People who are north of 50 typically like what they like and don't try that much new stuff. There's a couple other things though we can do. I've got friends here at the university that are doing insects as animal feed. Feed the bugs to the chickens and then eat the chickens. Maybe derive some environmental benefits that way. And here's one of my favorites. This is a granola bar I bought at the Ronald Reagan International Airport about 15 months ago. I was just about to get on a flight. I needed a snack to tide myself over on my flight back to Toronto. It's a peanut butter and jelly bar made with cricket flour. It was totally normal. Totally normal. Nothing remarkable about this protein bar in terms of the mouthfeel or the taste or anything like that. And here's another interesting one. It's a 3D printer developed in the Netherlands, designed to extrude alternative proteins. And the engineer that developed the technology, I'll come to you in just a sec, let me show you the quote. The engineer that developed the technology had a quotation accompanying the article. The look of the worms put me off, but in the shape of a cookie, I'll eat it. You had a comment.
Yeah, did you purposely buy that, or did you find out after you ate it?
Beg your pardon?
Did you purposely buy it because it was made with cricket flour, or did you accidentally buy it and then see it?
I'd seen those labels before, and so I was looking for a bar to eat as I got on the airplane, and because I knew that company but had never tried that product before, it jumped out at me. So I don't know, maybe a bit of column A, a bit of column B. Here's a story though that I think for me reveals something about the nature of it. And like I said, I don't. Let me start the story by saying I like steak and I like ice cream, like I said a few minutes ago. I don't imagine that we will ever give up our traditional livestock, but I do think it's going to shrink. And I say that without being judgmental or saying that has to happen or that ought to happen. I just think it's almost an inevitability that this transition is coming. And there's a reason why Maple Leaf has bought 3 plant-based protein companies and an insect-based protein. There's a reason why Tyson Foods has now bought Memphis Meats, the cell-grown meat company. There's a reason why Nestle is now making bacon without bacon. And that's because they're seeing growth in this market, and that will probably mean that the conventional livestock industry is going to have to innovate hard in order to survive as these new products come on the market. And to illustrate this, I'd like to take you to 1986, another story from my own childhood. 1986, I was 13 years old. I was watching Saturday Night Live, which I like to do every Saturday night in 1986 as a teenager. And one of their mock commercials came on, and it was hilarious. I remember it to this day, seeing it. It introduced me to a type of food I had never heard of before, but struck me as gross and hilarious. Does anybody want to make a guess what struck the 13-year-old Evan in the mid-1980s as gross and hilarious on late night comedy was? Nope. That's what's striking you as gross and hilarious. I'll give you a hint. It's something that it won't strike you as gross or hilarious. Yeah, well done. There we go. This is the screen capture from Saturday Night Live's archive. They have nothing left of this except this tiny little thumbnail. I can't find the sketch anywhere because it's not funny anymore. McSushi, America's eating it raw. And I just remember this little clappy sort of, jingle, and this sort of guy with a cowboy hat leaning into a pickup truck talking about, I'll eat raw fish. It was so stupid. In reflection, it was so stupid. Because within 15 years, California McDonald's were selling McSushi. And the joke was on the Saturday Night Live sketch writers. It wasn't on the sushi industry. Because tastes had changed, and sushi went from being hilarious and disgusting to totally normal, like in 15 years. So for me, the story of sushi reveals something about consumers, that price, demographic shifts, multiculturalism, a bit of savvy commercials, maybe some celebrity endorsements. I don't know what all the ingredients were, but sushi became mainstream. And here's an example that I think illustrates that maybe insects are on the cusp of being mainstream. So these are 2 classes that I've taught here at the University of Guelph for the last couple of years. On the right-hand side is a woman from Food and Nutrition Studies. She's just, this is this time last year, she did this. I took this photograph, and it was a insect brownies. She'd just done a presentation on alternative proteins and had just handed out cricket flour brownies to everybody in the class. And they were good brownies, perfectly good brownies. And then on the left-hand side, actually those are 2 former food science majors. They both graduated. This was about 3 years ago. It was the College Royal Festival 3 years ago. And the 2 women in the picture, they just won the College Royal Chili Contest with their feeding 9 billion cricket chili. And the judge was our Member of Parliament, Lloyd Longfield. And in his Twitter feed, he says, interesting, add cloves and cinnamon to insect protein. Yum, sustainable food supply available anywhere, bugs. So I think we've got a pretty strong case that maybe we're on the cusp of a big change already. All right, let me move on to the next sort of big chunk where I think technology and people and governance are going to change how things work in a big way. And it's all had to do with food system transparency. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but about 5 years ago, Europeans woke up aghast because they discovered that there was horse meat in their burritos and in their hamburgers. And essentially a series of unscrupulous racehorse owners from Eastern Europe had taken racehorses that were being euthanized, that were past their running days, euthanized them and mixed them into the food system where they got masqueraded as beef. And the way the beef was in the horse meat scandal, the horse in the horse meat scandal was discovered was actually using a technology developed here at the University of Guelph. So probably the most most senior scientist on campus is this guy named Paul Hebert. His office is just across the street from here. And he's created a technology called DNA barcoding that allows you to take a small tissue sample, do a quick DNA scan on it, run it through a reference library, and figure out what's in it. And it was DNA barcoding developed by Professor Hebert that revealed the horse in the horse meat scandal. And the prof that actually did the work in his lab was Bob Hanner, who's pictured here. And Bob's a good friend and has sort of launched a career in this area of food systems transparency. And the photograph in this particular shot was taken at a sushi restaurant in town. And a couple of my postdocs and I and Bob had sat down for sushi dinner. And if you look closely, Ian, the postdoc in the middle, he's got a little baggie. And we actually took bits of sushi back to Bob's lab and did DNA barcoding analysis on the sushi because we were worried that what we were being sold wasn't what we were being sold. And we discovered that none of the tuna that we ate that day was actually tuna. None of it. It was all an oily bycatch called escalar, which is banned in about 7 countries. Not banned in Canada, but banned in Italy, banned in Japan, because it can give you really bad, acidic, bright orange diarrhea. So that's what we ate. It was delicious. The crab wasn't crab, but we expected that. The wild salmon wasn't wild salmon, it was farmed salmon, but we expected that. But the thing we didn't expect was there to be complete fraud on the tuna fish. So what I'm saying here is that we've got these global food supply chains, and they're very, very hard to police. And as Bob says, the more we look for fraud, the more we find it. He did a study of sausages last October, so about a year ago now, in Canada, and discovered that about 1/5 of our sausages don't have what we think in them. Now, most cases it was chicken and turkey sausages or turkey and chicken sausages, which might not be as big a deal if you're on one level. But there was some pork in beef sausages, which actually became really a big issue because there'd been an outbreak of E. coli in pork that year. So they did a recall on pork, but they didn't recall the beef sausages because they didn't know there was pork in them. So from a food recall perspective, having transparency and actually honesty across a food chain is really, really important. From a sustainability perspective, it's really important. How can we prevent the trade in, say, endangered species of fish if we don't know what's in the fish, right? Like, because once you see a tilapia fillet, it's really hard to tell the difference between a tilapia and a bassa fillet. I mean, who knows as a consumer? So we need tools like DNA barcoding. We also need tools like blockchain, and a bunch of us here at the university, such as this guy, Malcolm Campbell, who's one of our vice presidents, are working to try to create technologies to create greater transparency in the food system. And that means not only things like DNA barcoding, but also blockchain-enabled technologies so that when a food goes from one agent to another, a producer to a distributor to a processor to a shipper, and a shipper to an aggregator, there's actually a digital ledger that's very hard to corrupt. So I think there's huge, exciting opportunities, and Canada, University of Guelph are really well poised to be a leader in food transparency. My fourth point is the point that directly references the stage of life that you folks are at. And I think that one of the solutions to this great challenge that I started off with at the beginning of this lecture is we need to do a better job of training you folks to take advantage of both the problems and also the opportunities. And for this part of my talk, I'll take us back once more to that driverless Case International Harvester tractor. And then I'll throw another picture up here. This is a robotic picker. Phenomenal technology going into this. Like the optical sensors, so this robot knows the difference between the ripe tomato and the not ripe tomato. Like, it's a phenomenal amount of very sophisticated robotics and computer programming go into creating this machine. We then have got the new wave of tractors, which actually are going small. I mean, tractor swarms, little tiny tractors scuttering across the field, all networked together. This is probably the future of tractors, not the great big Case International Harvester. But what do you note about these 4 pictures that I've just shown you? That's 1, that's 2, that's 3, That's 4. What's similar about those 4 photos?
Loss of jobs for farmers.
Loss of jobs for farmers. Yeah, I'm really worried that this Ag 4.0, the 4th Industrial Revolution, you know, the digital agriculture revolution, whatever you want to call it, I'm worried about what this means for rural families. So what do you guys think? I mean, we've got some farm folks sitting at the back of the room. Are you worried? Where are we going in terms of our rural communities with these technologies? Because I got to know my grandfather hanging out on the farm with that very primitive old tractor. But no one would use that old Massey Ferguson anymore. Yeah?
I think it's not going to get rid of all the jobs. I think it'll just change it. Like, just putting a robot in the dairy barn doesn't mean there's no people in the dairy barn at all. Like, there's still work, just changing how
Yep.
because, like, I don't know, a robot can spray feed and stuff like that. Program it, like, the jobs would just change it.
Different jobs, not no jobs. Yep, I think that's a pretty good assessment. Does anyone want to amplify that point or contradict it? Yeah.
My concern is with the increasing scale. Going on crop tour this fall, I saw a lot of loss of community in areas where farms were in the tens of thousands of acres, and where people are operations are capable of that. There's a collapse because of the redirection of jobs. There's a loss of rural community.
Yep.
And services.
So I'm going to agree with both of your points. Certainly, I'm observing changing jobs, and I'm observing hurting communities, and I think both are true. Yeah.
Just to add on to like robots, there's also like a change in your pay grade. Like instead of paying someone closer to minimum wage to work your cows, you're not getting paid like a technician or sales to higher pay grade.
Yeah, in the hort business, we're basically taking seasonal workers out of the equation because they're being automated and replacing those jobs with higher paying jobs, which creates a question of what those seasonal workers are going to do now that those low paid jobs are gone. But yep.
I think there's also the evolution thing about the fact that you need to have robots do the job because it's harder and harder to find people who actually want to do that physical labor.
Extremely good point. Extremely good point.
Too good for that these days, even though you have to start.
I mean, I didn't grow up in a dairy farm, but the idea of a 5 a.m. milking sounds terrible, right? If I could get a robot to milk at 5 in the morning, I mean, that sounds like a big improvement in my quality of life. Yeah, and then we'll move on.
I think we're also discovering a lot more small management things that we want to do, like on a more specific level. And so if we have all the technology to do the more general, larger jobs, it's going to allow us to produce better, higher quality.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're diagnosing the situation very well. I sat on stage a few months ago with a woman from the vintner from Peller Estate, so one of the big Niagara Estate wineries, and it was a panel discussion about these sort of issues, and she pulled out her smartphone and said, I can change the total management of my vineyard in Niagara on my phone. I can turn the wind machines on, I can turn irrigation on and off. I've got sensors almost on every plant in the soil that gives me water, soil moisture readings, so I know when to turn, I mean, I can automate it, right? And she said, and we've got the same number of employees, except they've moved from the back of the desk or the back of the farm, and they've moved to the front of the desk. So they've now got the same number of employees, but they're marketing, their customer relations, they're sommeliers, they're building markets with restaurants. There's not as many jobs for people tending the grapes. That's kind of what you're saying, right? They're moving essentially out of the farm and into the sort of the farm shop, in a sense. And I think the data bears this out, but it means something important for us in this room, both me as an educator and you as a student in this. So the data is pretty clear that you're right. Last year, Ontario Ag College put out this report. They actually say there's 4 jobs for every graduate. I mean, this is one of the biggest growth sectors in the economy right now for young people. The gap is we can't graduate you guys fast enough, in a sense. And there's going to be an increase, not a decrease, in new jobs over the next 5 years. And interestingly, the analysis is suggesting this is happening across the entire economy. Agriculture and food is at the high end of this, but what I'm describing here is pretty common across the economy. So that thing I was doing with the woman from Peller Estates a few months ago was actually the launch of this report. And this is called Humans Wanted, How Canadian Youth Can Thrive in an Age of Disruption. And it was produced by the Royal Bank of Canada that has gotten very interested in this. And they, much like what OAC did for the ag sector, RBC did for the Canadian economy. And they said that a quarter of Canadian jobs are going to be heavily disrupted by technology. And their economy is expected to grow jobs over the next 5 years, 2.4 million new jobs. But each of these jobs will require an increase in demand for what they're calling foundational skills: critical thinking, coordination, communication, social perceptiveness, active listening, complex problem solving. You know, the folks that I was talking to that wrote this report said, you know, learning how to program is really important, but you know, the technology is changing so fast, and the programming languages and the programming platforms, that actually learning how to problem solve and work in groups is actually more important and harder to teach than a programming language. So I actually don't think that the robots are coming for us. I don't think Ben Kinsley and Pamela, what's the actor on the right's name? She was from the X-Files. Gillian Anderson, thank you. Thank you, Gillian Anderson. Ben Kinsley and Gillian Anderson, they probably didn't make the best career move when they signed up for the robot overlords. But I think we need to be doing things differently. You folks need to be doing things differently in terms of the courses you take and the majors you select. And we, the profs, need to be doing things differently in terms of giving you an opportunity. Am I out of time, or are we got 10 more minutes? 7 more? Okay. That's what I was expecting. And so what we're trying to do, and maybe you'll be interested in this, we've got a program called the Ideas Congress Feeding 9 Billion Challenge. You can take it in your 3rd or 4th year, and basically you get to work with me and a couple other profs, and we have food-related community partners, and we try to give you a chance to work in small groups with those food-related community partners. And that is super fun. It's hard work, but you might want to think for your upper years of looking up the Ideas Congress Feeding 9 Billion program as a course you take, because what we're trying to do is work alongside your majors and give you a chance to practice those foundational skills. And then last year we had a really great group that actually did this. There's a picture from one of our groups from last year. And they actually worked with a group of farmers to take asymmetrical peaches, carrots, and pears, and created a food that would otherwise go to waste product for school nutrition programs. And there was the 2 members of that team and me being interviewed by the folks at the RBC, folks that were doing this RBC stuff. And if any of you have any interest in looking up this food science project that we worked on as a team, there's a link to a podcast that we did. My final point, as I wrap this up, is I think there is also tremendous growth, not only in digital technologies, new kinds of food science, transparency, education. I think there's also huge opportunities in local food. And lots of people look at that global system and look at the drought in California and look at the problems of industrial agriculture, specifically in California and the Midwest, and say, look, Canada is vulnerable. I mean, our food system is vulnerable to things that happen south of the border. And 2 years ago, we experienced a price shock. Got in yet another trade war with the U.S., and that really affected our prices. And a lot of people look at those big tractors and those rural communities, and a lot of people look at the massive scale of agriculture and say, look, I want an alternative. I want my food to be an alternative that's diverse, that's local, that involves people. The craft industry. This is my favorite cider. Why? I mean, it's a good cider, but it's by where my grandfather's old cottage used to be. And the reason I buy it is simply because I really like Duxbury. It's just nice. And what I'm not saying is that we should all be eating local all the time. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying, though, is one of my predictions into the future is that there will be a growth in this local stuff. and that this local food system offers a lot of great opportunities. I'll skip that slide. So let me just summarize in one slide where I think I've tried to come from. Today, I think we're going to see declines in some aspects of our food system. And again, I say this not sort of anticipating this because I'm looking forward to it, but this is me reading the tea leaves. And I think that there's a critical mass of people who are thinking, all right, that sort of food crisis stuff that I talked about at the beginning of my lecture, all that food waste, we have to do things a little differently. And in particular, I made a prediction that I think that the conventional protein industry is going to go through some tough times. And if any of you are invested in that, I would encourage you to talk to the folks that you're working with about how you can innovate and navigate the headwinds that are coming, because I'm worried on this regard. I think that the farmers and the parts of the food sector that are going to survive are those that are going to go hard into technology, by which I mean the variable application stuff, the new sources of protein, and there's good opportunities there. And there's also growth opportunities, but not to the same extent, but still good growth opportunities in that local system. And that's where I think we're going to go. Now, I'm basically out of time. Just for the sake of it, I've put on when Mike puts his slides up, there is a wrap-up slide that sort of gives you, gives you my key points. But that's all I've got to say. Thank you.